This is my true story. I buried my son 20 years ago. For 2 full decades, I stood beside his grave every Sunday. Not once did I miss a visit. Not in the rain, not in the snow, not in the suffocating summer heat of New Jersey. My son's phone number is still in my contacts. I never deleted it. Not because I hoped for a miracle, but because deleting it felt like losing him one more time. Last month my phone rang at 2:47 in the morning. I woke up in my quiet apartment in Newark, still half asleep. The glow of the phone screen lit up the dark ceiling above me. And then I saw a name I had only seen on a gravestone for the past 20 years. Taryn. My son's name lit up the screen. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. I just stared at the phone, as if staring long enough would make the name disappear. But the phone kept vibrating, kept ringing. Kept being there. I answered. On the other end of the line, a voice came through, trembling, confused, as if waking up in a strange place. "Mom, where am I?" It was him. My dead son was calling me. Confused, afraid, asking why nothing around him made sense. I couldn't say a word. My chest tightened, as if all the air had been sucked out of the room. I could only hear my son's breathing on the other end of the line, and my own heart pounding wildly. Before I tell you what happened next, let me know where you're watching this story from. And if you can, please subscribe to the channel so this story can reach more people. 20 years ago, I buried my son beneath an old oak tree at Fairmount Cemetery in Newark. His name is carved into cold gray stone. Taryn James Price, born April 12, 1986, died November 3, 2005. 19 years old, but before I tell you about my son's death, I need you to understand who Taryn was. Not the name on the gravestone, not the number 19, but the son I gave birth to, raised, loved, and lost. Taryn was born on a rainy night in April. I still remember the thunder rolling outside the windows of University Hospital Newark. Rain hammered against the glass as if the entire sky were collapsing onto the city. When the doctor placed my son in my arms for the first time, he didn't cry. He just looked at me. Big, dark brown eyes, exactly like mine, staring straight into my face with an intensity that felt almost unsettling, as if he were trying to remember me from another lifetime. From a young age, Taryn was a quiet child. Not the timid or fearful kind of quiet, but the quiet of a child who was always thinking. He would sit by the window of our small Newark apartment, resting his chin in his hands, watching people move along the street below. When I asked him what he was thinking about, he answered naturally, "I'm imagining what their lives are like, Mom. Everyone has their own story." A 7-year-old saying something like that. In that moment, I knew my son was different. When Taryn was 7, he fell off his bike on the sidewalk in front of our building. I was in the kitchen when I heard his scream. I ran outside and saw his right arm bent at a strange angle. Broken. I rushed him into the car and drove straight to the emergency room. My heart felt like it was being torn apart every time I heard him cry from the back seat. But once we were in the doctor's office, Taryn went silent. He gripped my hand tightly while the doctor set the cast. Sweat poured down his forehead. His face was pale, but he didn't make a single sound. When it was over, he looked at me calmly and said, "Don't worry, Mom. I'm okay. I'm strong, just like you." A 7-year-old saying that to his mother. I hugged him and cried right there in the examination room. Taryn didn't understand why I was crying. He simply patted my shoulder with his uninjured arm and said, "Mom, it only hurt a little. It's over now." His arm healed after 6 weeks, but the small scar on his elbow never faded. Every time I see that scar, I remember my resilient little boy, the child who always worried about his mother more than himself. There are children you feel you need to protect. And then there are children who make you realize that you are the one who needs protecting. Taryn was the second kind. And that is what made losing him the cruelest thing I have ever endured. Taryn grew into a tall, strong young man, about 1.80 meters tall. Broad shoulders, big hands, hands that helped me fix a broken kitchen cabinet, change light bulbs, straighten crooked doors in our small apartment. He played basketball in high school. not the star of the team, but the teammate everyone wanted beside them on the court. Tehran always passed the ball to whoever had the better shot, always encouraged his teammates when they failed. His coach once told me, "Tehran has the heart of a captain, Mrs. Price. Your son doesn't play for himself. He plays for everyone." But Tehran's true passion wasn't on the basketball court. It was on paper. His room was always filled with charcoal sketches, portraits, landscapes, abstract drawings filled with deep emotion. Drawings I didn't always fully understand, but I knew he created them with his entire soul. There was one drawing I will never forget. Tehran drew me sitting by the window, holding a cup of coffee, staring outside. My face looked tired. My eyes were sad. The lines in the drawing captured the loneliness I always tried to hide. I asked him, "Why did you draw me looking so sad?" Tehran answered gently, "Because I know you're sad, Mom. You try to hide it, but I know. I wanted to draw what I really see. I want you to know that I understand." I couldn't say anything. A 16-year-old boy had seen through pain I had hidden for years. The loneliness after divorce, the exhaustion of raising a child alone, the financial pressure that never stopped, the nights I sat on my bed, staring at stacks of bills, wondering how I would pay everything that month. Tehran understood all of it. But he never added to my burden. Instead, he took weekend shifts at the neighborhood grocery store. He handed me money and said, "So you don't have to worry as much. I want to help." In his senior year of high school, Tehran was accepted into Montclair State University, a partial scholarship for art. The day the acceptance letter arrived, he ran home, hands shaking as he held the white envelope. "Mom, I got in!" he shouted from the doorway. "They gave me a scholarship. I can go to college." I hugged him in our cramped living room. I cried. I cried from pride, from relief, from knowing my son would have a better future than the life I had lived. He wouldn't have to work 3 jobs at once like I did. He wouldn't have to worry every month about rent. We celebrated with pizza from the corner shop, no fancy restaurant, just pizza and soda on our small kitchen table. But it was one of the happiest dinners of my life. Tehran beamed as he told me about his dreams. "I want to be a real artist, Mom. I want to hold exhibitions. I want to create paintings that make people feel something." He looked at me seriously, like how I feel when I look at you. Then he added more slowly, "One day, I'll buy you a beautiful house. You won't have to worry about money anymore." I promise. The promises of an 18-year-old, pure, sincere, full of hope. I reached across the table and held his hand. "I'm already proud," I said, my voice breaking. "I've been proud of you since the day you were born. You don't need to do anything else to make me prouder." Tehran squeezed my hand. "I know," he said, "but I still want to." 2 months later, my son died. If what you've heard so far has captured your attention, please subscribe to the channel and leave a like on this video. I would truly appreciate it, and I am ready to continue with the next part of the story. The accident happened on a Friday night, November 3rd, 2005. Tehran was driving home after his part-time shift at the grocery store. It was just a normal shift, a 19-year-old son working to help his mother, then driving home with unfinished plans still ahead of him. On his way back, a truck ran a red light and slammed straight into the driver's side. The impact killed him instantly. That's what the police told me. No pain, no suffering, just gone. Like blowing out a candle. I got the call at 11:43 at night. I remember exactly, because I was watching the news, and I glanced at the clock at the exact moment the phone rang. An officer said there had been an accident. His voice was careful, the kind of voice trained to deliver news no one wants to hear. He didn't say it directly. "Your son was in an accident," he said. "There was an accident involving your son," as if wording it that way could make it less horrible. But I knew immediately. Mothers always know. There was something in his voice, in the way he avoided saying the truth out loud, in the tiny hesitations before each sentence. It felt like a door had already closed, and it was only waiting for you to step forward to find out which side you were trapped on. I drove 90 miles an hour through the streets of Newark. I ran red lights. I didn't care if I caused an accident. There was even a part of me that hoped I would crash. At least then I wouldn't have to face what was waiting for me at the hospital. When I arrived, a nurse met me right at the entrance. She didn't ask much. She just looked at me, and that look was enough for me to understand everything. She led me into a private room, a small room, a soft chair. A box of tissues placed neatly on the table, and in that moment I knew for sure. They only use private rooms for bad news. A private room is where they tell you that someone you love is dead. A doctor came in. He was young, maybe around 30. He sat down across from me, hands clasped together as if trying to stay calm for both of us. "Mrs. Price," he said, "I'm so sorry." We did everything we could, but I couldn't hear the rest. All I heard was a long ringing in my ears. The room tilted. I thought I was going to faint. "I want to see my son," I said. My voice sounded distant, as if it were coming from someone else. They led me into a cold room, fluorescent lights so bright they stung my eyes. Taryn was lying on a hospital bed, a white sheet covering his body. They pulled the sheet down so I could see his face, and the strangest thing was, Taryn's face wasn't damaged. After a crash that violent, there should have been something, a mark, a distortion, something that would make me understand that this was no longer my son. But no, he looked like he was sleeping, peaceful, his lips slightly parted, as if he were about to exhale. His eyelids gently closed, as if all I had to do was call his name and he would open his eyes and say, "Mom, I'm home." I touched his hand. It was still warm. And that was what broke me, because his body was still warm. But Taryn was gone. His soul had left it behind, leaving a warm shell I couldn't keep. I kept thinking he would wake up. I stood there for 2 hours, waiting for one thing, his chest to move. A breath, a sign of life, a miracle. But nothing came. I remember every detail of that room like a punishment my mind forced me to record. The sharp smell of disinfectant so strong it made me want to vomit. The cold fluorescent light reflecting off the white linoleum floor. The beeping machines from the room next door. And Tehran's hand resting motionless on the sheet. Those long fingers that once drew entire worlds in his sketches. Now, they would never draw again. A nurse came in and asked if I needed anything. I shook my head. All I needed was my son to come back to life. And no one on earth could give me that. My ex-husband arrived an hour later. He ran into the hospital, face crumpled, eyes panicked. When they told him, he screamed, loud enough that security had to rush over. No way, not my son," he shouted. "Check again. You've got the wrong person." "That isn't Tehran!" Then he collapsed onto the floor in the hallway, sobbing like a child. They had to call another doctor. They gave him a sedative. He couldn't go into the identification room. He couldn't sign the paperwork. He couldn't do anything except lie on a chair in the waiting room and stare at a blank wall as if he stared long enough, the truth would disappear. And so I did everything alone. I signed the confirmation of the body. My hand shook so hard my signature was barely readable. I chose the funeral home. I chose the casket, oak lined with white satin. I thought Tehran would like white. It was pure, peaceful. I chose the grave plot at Fairmount Cemetery, beneath a large oak tree. Tehran used to say he liked sitting under trees. "Trees make me feel protected," he once said. So I chose a place with a tree. I wrote the obituary. I sat at the kitchen's table at 3 a.m, staring at a blank sheet of paper, not knowing where to begin. How do you summarize a life in a few lines? How do you write about the son you love so much it hurts? In the end, I wrote, Tehran James Price, 19 years old, passed away on November 3rd, beloved son of Vanessa Price. A talented artist, a good friend, a kind soul. He loved family, art, and making this world a better place. He will be remembered forever. Too little. Too short, but no words are ever enough. There was a moment when I realized grief doesn't arrive like a punch. It arrives like a to-do list. You have just lost your only child, but you still have to choose a casket. Still have to choose flowers, still have to sign papers, still have to pay. And the cruelest part is, While you are doing those things, everyone looks at you like you're so strong, while inside you have already shattered into pieces. The funeral took place 4 days later. A gray November afternoon. It was cold. The wind blew leaves down around the cemetery. About 30 people came, Tehran's friends from school. A few relatives, my co-workers. They stood around the grave in black clothing, faces heavy like the sky that day. My ex-husband stood beside me, but he didn't look at the casket. He stared at the ground through the entire service. My sister had to hold him up. His hands trembled violently. The pastor read prayers. I didn't hear a word. I only stared at the polished oak casket. My son was in there. His body lay inside a sealed box, and I would never see his face again, never touch him again, never hear his voice again. Tehran's friends threw flowers onto the casket, white roses. My ex-husband threw in a letter he had written. I had watched him sit at the hotel table the night before, writing through tears. But me, I didn't throw anything. I just stood there and watched. When they lowered the casket, I heard the machinery, the cables tightening, the sound of the casket hitting the bottom of the grave. Those sounds will haunt me forever. After everyone left, I stayed. The workers stood at a distance, waiting to give me time. Finally, one of them walked over, voice polite but full of pity. "Mrs. Price, we need to finish the job." I nodded. "I want to watch." He looked at me, clearly surprised. "Ma'am, are you sure?" "I need to see it," I said. "I need to know he's really down there." And I stood there and watched them fill the grave, shovel after shovel of dirt, shovel after shovel covering the casket holding my son. I counted 126 shovels to fill a grave. When they packed down the last of the soil, only then did I walk away. But a part of me stayed there. A part of me was still standing by that grave, staring down at the fresh earth, unable to believe Tehran was beneath it. From that day on, I was no longer Vanessa Price. I became a mother who lost her child. That was my new identity, the only identity I had left. For 20 years, I visited Tehran's grave every Sunday. Rain, sun, snow, it didn't matter. I brought flowers. White roses, Tehran's favorite. I talked to him as if he were still there, as if he could still hear me. "How was your week?" I always started like that. As if from beneath the earth, Tehran would answer, "Mom, I'm okay." "Don't worry." But there was no reply. Only wind moving through the oak tree, only distant birds, and the silence of the dead. I told him about my boring office job, about coworkers who complained all day about meaningless things, about bills, about days when I didn't want to get out of bed, about nights when I lay staring at the ceiling, wondering why I was still alive, when my son was dead. One Sunday, I placed my hand on the cold stone and said, "Do you remember your 10th birthday? I baked a chocolate cake. You blew out the candles and wished for something." I swallowed hard. "You didn't say what you wished for, but I know. You wished Mom would worry less about money. You wished Mom and Dad would stop fighting. You always wished for other people, never for yourself." The wind was cold. I pulled my coat tighter. "Do you know what I wish for now?" I whispered. "I wish I could die instead of you. I wish I were under this ground, and you were alive. You had your whole life ahead of you, and me, I've lived enough." But wishing doesn't bring the dead back. My ex-husband stopped coming to the grave after the first year. "Vanessa, I can't," he said. "Every time I go there, I die all over again. I need to move on." "Move on?" I stared at him. "How do you move on? Our son is dead." "I know," he answered, his voice exhausted. "But I can't live like you. I can't live in this museum. Tehran's room is still untouched. His things are all over the house. You talk to him like he's still here. Vanessa, our son is dead. He isn't coming back. We divorced 3 years after Tehran died. Grief killed the marriage. There was nothing left to say, and every time we looked at each other, we only remembered what we had lost. He remarried a year later. A good woman. She likes tennis. She laughs easily. They had a little girl. I saw the pictures on Facebook. Him holding the baby girl, smiling brightly. I wasn't angry. I understood. He needed a new life. He needed to forget. But I couldn't. I kept Tehran's room exactly the same. His clothes still hung in the closet. His books still sat on the shelf. The drawing he made of me was still there, and his phone number was still in my contacts. I paid the phone bill every month, even though the number had been disconnected. $30 a month just to keep my son's number alive in my phone. People said I was wasting money. I didn't care. It was the only $30. That meant anything. The worst part was watching Tehran's friends grow up and live the life my son should have had. I saw Jamal, Tehran's best friend, graduate college. A Facebook photo, cap and gown, a bright smile, his parents standing on either side, proud. Tehran should have been there too. He should have been the one wearing that cap and gown. I should have been standing beside him, proud until I couldn't breathe. Keisha, his high school girlfriend, got married. I saw her in a white wedding dress, beautiful and happy. I wondered, if Tehran had lived, would he have married Keisha? Would I have been at my son's wedding? Would I have become a grandmother? Marcus, his basketball friend, had his first child. A baby boy. I saw him pushing a stroller through the park near our building, tired but happy. Every time I saw those things, it felt like a knife twisting into my heart again. Why did they get to live when my son didn't? My son was kinder. My son was better. My son deserved to live more. I know that thought isn't fair, but grief doesn't care about fairness. I learned to live around the hole Tehran left behind. You don't get over losing a child. You just learn to walk very carefully around the empty space they leave. You learn how to function. Wake up, go to work, pay bills, shop for groceries, nod through small talk, pretend you're fine in front of other people, but you are never fine. Inside, you're only an empty shell, a person drifting from one day to the next without truly living. Every birthday that passed without him was its own kind of torture. The year Tehran should have turned 21, I bought a cake. I put 21 candles in it. I sat alone in the kitchen and sang happy birthday. My voice fell apart. Tears dripped onto the cake. I blew out the candles for him. I wished he were alive. At 22, I did it again. 23. 24. Every year, one more candle. Every year, another layer of pain. This year, Tehran should have been 39, almost 40. He should have had a wife, children, a career, a whole life. He should have lived exactly what he once dreamed of, what he once promised. But my son froze at 19, forever young, forever taken. I accepted it. I had no choice. Death is final, until last month. At 2:47 in the morning on September 14th, my phone rang. The sound jolted me upright as if I'd been yanked out of sleep. I reached for the phone on the nightstand, my eyes still blurry, my mind still floating between dream and reality. I squinted at the screen. Caller ID, Tehran. His profile photo stared straight at me, a picture taken on his 18th birthday. My son was smiling, alive, young, the kind of smile that, just seeing it, is enough to make you believe tomorrow will be okay. I sat there frozen. My heart thudded in my chest. The room suddenly felt colder. My hand shook so badly I almost dropped the phone. Impossible. Tehran's number had been disconnected for 19 years. I kept it in my contacts, but it no longer worked. Over the years, I had tried calling it more times than I can count. Hundreds of times, maybe more. And every single time, the same cold, automated voice came on. The number you have dialed is no longer in service. But now, it was calling me. The phone kept ringing. 4 rings, 5 rings. My thumb hovered over the answer button. My brain screamed, "Don't pick up! This is a glitch! This is a cruel joke!" But my heart said only one thing. What if there's even a 1 in a million chance that it's really him? On the 6th ring, I pressed the button. I lifted the phone to my ear. For the first 3 seconds, I heard nothing, just silence. A dead, empty gap, as if the other end didn't even exist. I was about to hang up when I heard breathing, slow, steady breaths in and out, so real it sent ice down my spine. Someone was there, my throat locked up. I tried to say hello, but no sound came out. And then a voice spoke, weak, confused. "Mom." Just one word, but it was enough for my world to collapse and rebuild in the very same instant. It was Tehran's voice. I know my son's voice. I've heard it in my head every day for 19 years. I hear it in dreams, in those moments when I wake in the middle of the night with my chest feeling like someone is squeezing it shut. This was him. Not a recording. A recording doesn't breathe like that. A recording doesn't have that tremble of real fear. This was Tehran, truly him. "Mom, are you there?" His voice broke, desperate. "Mom, please answer me." I forced air into my lungs as if forcing myself back to life. I forced words out of my throat. "Tehran." My voice was nothing but a whisper, shattered. Is that you?" Silence. So long I thought I was about to lose my mind. Then he answered very softly, "Yes." "It's me, Mom, but I don't understand. I don't know where I am. Nothing makes sense." "Where are you?" I asked, and my hand flipped on the room light by reflex. I needed to see light, to see everything clearly, to make sure I wasn't dreaming. "Tell me what's happening." "I don't know," Tehran said. I heard his breathing quicken, like he was panicking. "Mom, I remember the accident. I remember the truck hitting me. I remember dying." His words cut like a knife. "You remember dying?" I repeated, and even I could hear myself saying something impossible. "Yes," Tehran's voice shook. "I felt the impact. I felt pain. I felt everything go dark. I know I died, Mom. I can feel it. But then I woke up, and everything is different." I sprang out of bed. My legs shook so badly I could barely stand. "Different how?" I asked. "I look different. I'm in a place I don't know. And people walk right through me like I don't exist." His voice cracked. "Mom, I'm scared. I've been trying to figure out what happened, but I don't understand anything." I found a phone. "Your number is the only number I remember. I had to call you." Tears ran down my face. "Are you hurt? Are you in pain?" I asked, rapid fire, as if hearing him say "it hurts" would give me something to grab onto, something concrete, some ordinary logic of the world. No pain," he answered, "but I feel wrong. Everything feels wrong. Can you come pick me up?" His voice fully broke. "Please, Mom." "I don't want to be here alone." "Tell me where you are," I said, almost shouting with fear. I grabbed a pen and paper from the drawer. "Give me the address. I'm coming right now." "I don't know the address," Tehran said. "I'm in a building." "Dark. There are apartments. Wait, Mom. I'll try to find—" I heard movement, footsteps, a door opening. Then the line dropped. A hard drop, no warning, no goodbye, just a straight fall into silence. I pulled the phone away from my ear. The screen showed, "Call ended, 9:43, 9 minutes, 43 seconds. I had just spoken to my dead son for 9 minutes and 43 seconds. I called back immediately. The automated voice came on, cold as stone. "The number you have dialed is no longer in service." I tried again, same message. I tried 15 times. Every time, the same emotionless sentence. I took a screenshot of the call history. I needed proof. I needed something to prove I wasn't insane. Tehran, 2:47 a.m., 9:43. I couldn't sleep after that. I sat on the bed holding my phone until morning, replaying the conversation in my head like a haunting film. His voice, the way he said "Mom," the fear in his breathing, the confusion, and the feeling like he was trapped somewhere not meant for human beings. At 6:30 in the morning, I drove to Fairmount Cemetery. I needed to see the grave, needed to see proof that Tehran was still there, under the ground, and not somewhere else calling me. The morning was cold and gray. Fog hung low. I walked to the familiar oak tree. The grave was exactly the same as always. Gray stone, fresh flowers from 3 days before, hard ground with no sign it had been dug up or disturbed. I knelt down and placed my hand on the damp grass. "Tehran," I whispered. "Are you down there? Or did you go somewhere?" No answer, only wind moving through the tree. For the next 3 days, I barely ate, barely slept. I kept my phone with me at all times, afraid of missing a call. I was afraid to shower because the phone might ring at that exact moment. I was afraid to leave the house, afraid to step out the door because if something happened, I wouldn't be able to hear him calling. I called in sick. No explanation. Just, "I can't come in. I'm taking leave." My neighbor knocked on the door. "Vanessa, are you okay? I haven't seen you come out in days." I didn't answer. I just sat still in the dark room until she left. If I told anyone, they would think I was crazy, and maybe I really was. I'll tell you the truth, something I have never told anyone. In those 3 days, the scariest part wasn't that Tehran called. It was that I started to doubt myself. I looked in the mirror and asked, "Vanessa, have you hurt so much that your brain created a voice to comfort you?" I looked at the screenshot of the call and wondered, did I press the wrong thing, save the wrong name, imagine all of it? But then I remembered the breathing on the other end. I remembered the way my son said "Mom," like someone standing on the edge of a cliff, and I understood. If this was a hallucination, then it was so real I couldn't ignore it. I had to know the truth, no matter what that truth was. On the 4th day, at 3:15 in the morning, the phone rang again. Name, Tehran. His photo. I answered immediately without hesitating. "Tehran! Mom!" Tehran's voice came through, worse than the first time, exhausted, almost desperate. "I found it. I found the address." My heart leapt. "Where? Tell me right now." 1127 Wyoming Avenue, apartment number 8, Scranton, Pennsylvania. He read it slowly, clearly. I wrote fast. My hand shook violently. "Pennsylvania? You're in Pennsylvania? That's 2 states away." "I don't know how I got here, Mom." Tehran's voice caught. "Today I went outside. People looked right through me. A woman, she walked into me. She really walked straight through me like I wasn't real. Like I'm a ghost or something." "You're not a ghost," I said, even though my own heart was pounding so wildly it felt like it might break my ribs. "Ghosts can't use phones." Tehran let out a short laugh, painful and desperate. "Then what am I?" he asked. I looked in the mirror and saw a stranger's face, older than me, almost like me, but not exactly. "Mom, I'm so confused. I'm so tired. Please come pick me up. I don't want to be here anymore." Those last 3 words crushed me. "I'm coming," I said. "You stay there. Do you hear me? I'm leaving right now. I'll be there in 8 hours. Wait for me. Promise me. You'll wait." "I'll try," Tehran answered, his voice smaller. "Mom, I'm so scared." "I know, baby." I swallowed my tears. "I'm scared too. But I'm coming to find you. I promise." The line dropped. This time, I didn't call back. I knew it would be useless. I jumped out of bed, threw clothes into a bag, grabbed my wallet, my keys. I didn't call anyone. I didn't tell anyone. I just got into my car and started driving to Scranton, Pennsylvania. From Newark to Scranton is 8 hours. I did it in 7.5. I drove 85 miles an hour. I clung to the highway as if slowing down for even 1 minute would make Tehran disappear. I passed slow cars. I slipped through yellow lights. I stopped only once to get gas and buy coffee. I drank the coffee while driving. The whole way, my mind circled like a trapped animal. What would I find? Was Tehran really there? Or was this only the hallucination of a mother so desperate for her son that she created a false reality? But the calls were real. I had proof. Screenshots. Call history. Unless I had created all of it myself. No. I'm not crazy. His voice was real. I know my son's voice. I had to find out the truth. I arrived in Scranton at 11:47 in the morning. The GPS led me into an old neighborhood on the east side of town. In front of me was a 4-story red brick apartment building, probably built in the 1970s. But something was wrong immediately. The first-floor windows were boarded up. The front door was chained with a large padlock. On the fence was a faded orange sign, "Condemned, no trespassing. Scheduled for demolition." My stomach dropped straight down. This building was abandoned, scheduled to be torn down. Tehran couldn't be here. No one could be here. I parked and stared at the building. For 10 full minutes. There had to be a mistake. Maybe Tehran read the address wrong. Maybe I misheard because I was shaking. But when I looked back at my note, 1127 Wyoming Avenue, I wrote it correctly. Every number. I got out of the car. The street was silent. Not a single person. The metal fence had a hole. I slipped through it and moved closer to the building. The front door was locked tight, but on the side there was a door with a broken lock. I pushed gently. The door creaked open. I stood still, holding my breath, listening. No sound. I stepped into the darkness. The smell of mold, rot, and old mud hit my face and nearly made me choke. I turned on my phone flashlight. A hallway appeared. Peeling wallpaper, filthy carpet, graffiti smeared across the walls. Many apartment doors were wide open. Empty, trash-filled, broken furniture. This place had been abandoned for a long time. Not a few months, but many years. I checked the first floor. Nothing. The second floor, the same. The third floor. Apartment number 8 was at the end of the third-floor hallway, and it was different. While every other door had been smashed, left open, rotted away, the door to apartment 8 was closed, undamaged. The number 8 hung straight, and stranger still, it wasn't old or rusted. It was bright brass metal, as if it had just been polished. I stood in front of that door, my heart pounding like a drum roll. I reached out and wrapped my hand around the doorknob. Not locked. The door opened smoothly, silently, unnaturally so, in a building this decayed. I stepped inside, and then I stopped breathing. That apartment was perfect in a way that was terrifying. While every other unit in this building had been smashed apart, abandoned like a rotting corpse, apartment number 8 looked as if someone had stepped out only minutes ago. The walls were painted a pale blue, spotless, not a single patch of peeling paint, no stains. No cracks. The beige carpet beneath my feet was flawless, and the fresh vacuum lines were still visible, neat and perfectly straight, like someone had just finished cleaning. The air inside didn't smell moldy. There was none of the damp rot I had just breathed in out in the hallway. In here there was only the scent of soap and coffee, the kind of smell that makes you believe this is a place for living, not a place for dying. I walked farther in, my legs weak, as if they no longer belonged to me. The living room was fully furnished. A brown sofa, a coffee table, a television. Everything was tidy, organized, nothing excessive. There were framed photos on the wall. I stepped closer, and my vision suddenly blurred, as if my brain didn't want to accept what it was seeing. They were photos of my family, me, my ex-husband, and Tehran. Pictures from when Tehran was little. His first day of kindergarten, holding a backpack, smiling with missing teeth. His 10th birthday, blowing out candles, his face glowing. Christmas at 12, opening gifts under our small tree. High school graduation, wearing a blue and gold cap and gown. I have these exact photos at home, in a box. In albums, I remember every angle, every streak of light, every crease along the edge of each print. So how were they here? Who put them here? And why here, in a condemned building scheduled for demolition? I reached out and touched a frame. The glass was clean, not a speck of dust. Hung recently. So recently, it felt like someone was still taking care of them. I shifted to the wall beside it. And this time, I knew I was stepping across a line I could never come back from. It was still Tehran. But these photos could not exist. Tehran at 20, standing in front of a university building in graduation robes. He was smiling like sunlight. I don't have that photo. I can't have it, because Taryn died before he ever went to college. Another photo. Taryn around 30, sitting in a coffee shop with a few friends. Those faces were strangers to me. I had never seen them in my life. Another. Tehran at 35, standing right in front of this same apartment building with that same smile, but older, steady, like someone who had lived long enough to understand the world. My hands shook as I lifted my phone and photographed every single picture. Evidence. I needed evidence. If I didn't have it, I would think I was hallucinating. I walked into the kitchen. There were clean dishes on the drying rack. On the counter sat a coffee cup with brown liquid still at the bottom. I touched the side of the cup, warm. I opened the refrigerator. Inside was food, milk, eggs, leftovers in containers. I pulled out the milk carton and checked the expiration date, September 18th, 5 days from now. Fresh. Someone was living here. Eating here, drinking coffee here, in a building that had been sealed and condemned for demolition. I closed the refrigerator door, and that was when I saw a note held by a magnet on the fridge. Handwriting. I recognized it instantly. My heart felt like it was being crushed. It was Tehran's handwriting, that familiar messy script from middle school, the kind of writing I had seen on homework notebooks, on quick little messages, on the sketches he left behind in his room. I pulled the note off and read every line. Mom, if you're reading this, I don't know what's happening to me. I woke up here 3 weeks ago with no memory of how I got here. I have papers saying my name is Miles Oakes, 38 years old, works at the factory. Has an apartment and a life I don't remember living. But that isn't my life. I remember being Tehran. I remember you. I remember Dad. I remember dying in that accident. I felt the impact. I felt everything stop. Then I woke up here as someone else. 20 years have passed, but I don't remember any of it. People here know me as Miles. They've known me for years. But I'm not Miles. I'm Taryn, your son. I think I was supposed to be dead. I think something is wrong. I don't belong here. Please help me find out what happened. T. I read that note 3 times. I read that note. Not because I couldn't read it, but because I couldn't believe my mind was understanding it correctly. In the end, I folded it very carefully and slipped it into my pocket as if I were putting away a piece of someone's soul. I walked into the bedroom. The bed was neatly made. There were photos on the dresser, clothes hung in order, men's clothes, large size. On the nightstand sat a wallet and a set of keys. I picked up the wallet. Opened it. A driver's license. The photo on it made my heart stop for a beat. The man in that picture looked like an older version of Tehran. The same dark brown eyes. The same nose, and even the small scar on his chin. The scar I remembered clearly because Tehran had fallen when he was a child. But the name on the license was Miles James Oakes. Date of birth, April 12, 1986. Tehran's exact birthday. Address, 1127 Wyoming Avenue, Apartment 8, Scranton, Pennsylvania. I collapsed onto the bed as if my legs no longer had the strength to hold my body up. My son died 20 years ago. I identified his body. I buried him. I stood at his grave for 20 years. But according to this license, he had been living here under another name, living a life he didn't remember. I pulled open the nightstand drawer, paperwork, utility bills, the address under the name Miles Powell. Pay stubs from Scranton Steel Manufacturing, all of it dated from 6 years ago. The bottom drawer held a thick medical file. I opened it, and in that moment, I felt as if someone crushed my heart in their fist. Admission record, University Hospital, Newark. Date, November 3rd, 2005. Patient, John Doe, later identified as Miles Oakes. Reason, motor vehicle accident, severe head trauma, November 3rd, 2005. The day Tehran died. The same hospital. I kept reading, line by line, like each one was a hammer striking my skull. Patient admitted 11:58 p.m. following MVA at intersection of Broad St. and Market St. Critical condition. Multiple injuries including severe head trauma, fractured ribs, internal bleeding. Patient underwent emergency surgery, placed in medically induced coma. Patient regained consciousness November 9, 2005, 6 days post-accident. Exhibited complete retrograde amnesia. No memory of identity, personal history, or events prior to accident. No ID found at scene. Patient became John Doe. Case number 2005-1103-02. Social services involved. Patient released December 1st, 2005, with temporary housing assistance. Chose name Miles Oakes as he could not remember birth name. Issued new identification through state program for amnesia patients. My hands trembled as I held the paper. 2 people in the accident. Same day, same hospital. 1 died. 1 lived, but lost his memory. A horrifying thought slid into my mind like a cold knife under my ribs. What if they got it wrong? What if the one who lived was Taryn, and the one who died was someone else? In the file, I saw a doctor's card clipped to the edge. Dr. Sarah Chen, neurologist, University Hospital, Newark. I called immediately. My hand shook so badly I could barely press the buttons. "Neurology department, how may I help you?" the receptionist said. "I need to speak to Dr. Chen, urgently, about a patient from 2005. The name is Miles Oakes, or maybe another name. Please, I need to speak with her. You'll need to schedule an appointment." "No," I cut in, my voice nearly breaking. "This is an emergency. My son, I think my son, please let me speak to the doctor." I waited. 5 minutes, 10 minutes. Then another female voice came on. "This is Dr. Chen. Who is this?" "My name is Vanessa Price," I said, swallowing. My son, Teron Price, died in a car accident on November 3, 2005 at University Hospital, Newark. You treated a John Doe that same night. Same type of accident. That person woke up with amnesia and became Miles Oakes. Silence stretched out. Then Dr. Chen spoke, very carefully. "Mrs. Price, I remember that case. Very unusual. We had 2 young men brought in from the same intersection within an hour. Both had severe head trauma. 1 didn't make it. 1 survived, but lost all memory. Is there any chance they were mixed up?" I asked. "Charts switched? Could the one who died not have been my son?" A longer silence. "Mrs. Price," Dr. Chen's voice slowed, as if weighing every word. "Are you suggesting we misidentified your son's body?" "I'm suggesting something was wrong that night," I said, low but steady. "I'm suggesting the one who lived could be my son." "But you identified your son's body at the hospital," Dr. Chen reminded me. "You confirmed it yourself." "I know," I said, my throat tightening, "but I was in shock, in pain." What if I was wrong? What if in the darkness, in the grief, I made a mistake? I heard Dr. Chen's sigh on the other end. "Mrs. Price, I understand your suffering," she said, "but what you're saying is extremely serious. If there was an error in patient identification, that would be a major medical violation." "I know," I said. "That's why I need your help. Please review the records. Please check everything from that night." Silence. Then Dr. Chen said, "Give me until tomorrow. I'll pull all the files from storage. If there's anything unusual, I'll call you back." "Thank you," I breathed out. "Thank you so much." I hung up, and I sat motionless on the bed in this strange apartment, the apartment of the man who might be my son. I looked around. Clothes in the closet, shoes under the bed, books on the shelf, an entire life. A life that might have belonged to Taryn. I stayed in the apartment all day, searching through every corner like someone who had just discovered a secret world and feared that blinking would make it disappear. In the closet were work jackets, jeans, steel-toe boots, the life of a manual laborer. On the shelf were books on art, novels, and a sketchbook. I opened the sketchbook. Charcoal sketches, portraits, landscapes, and the style was frighteningly similar, like Tehran. My heart raced. Tehran drew. Miles drew, and the lines looked like they came from the same hands. I found mail from the company. Workplace address, Scranton Steel Manufacturing, 340 Industrial Drive. Night shift, 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. I looked at the clock, 6:30 in the evening. In 5 hours, Miles would be leaving for work, and that meant I only had a few hours to decide. I had to meet him, had to look straight into his face, had to look into his eyes to know for sure. But if it really was Tehran, what would I say? "Hello, I'm your mother. You died 20 years ago, but it turns out you're still alive?" He would think I was insane. He would call the police. I needed proof. I needed something undeniable. I thought of DNA. Dr. Chen could do a DNA test, compare it to mine. Then we would know for certain. But first, I still had to meet him. I needed to look into those eyes and ask myself a question I had never dared to ask in 20 years. Did my son really die? Or did his life simply split onto another path, running parallel to the one I was living? And do you know what the scariest part is? Not the condemned building. Not the photos that could not exist, not the medical file, but the feeling that I was standing between two worlds. One world where Tehran died, and I buried him beneath an oak tree. And one world where Tehran was still alive, only alive under another name, with an older face, living a life he didn't remember. I didn't know what I was stepping into. But I knew one thing for sure. If I met Miles Oakes tonight, my life would never have a way back again. 10:45 p.m. I parked outside Scranton Steel Manufacturing. The massive metal building was washed in harsh white floodlights, making everything look cold and severe. Trucks were lined up in rows. Men in protective gear, lunchboxes in hand, shuffled inside like the familiar current of a night shift. The shift was about to begin. I sat in my car with the lights off, blending into the darkness. My heart hammered wildly as if it were about to break through my ribs. I was about to see him, the man who might be my son. I wondered, and the question drilled into my head like a bit. If Tehran was truly still alive, would I recognize him? After 20 years, after another life, after another face. At 10:52, a silver Honda pulled into the lot and stopped exactly 3 spaces away from me. A man stepped out. Tall, lean, wearing jeans and a brown jacket. He grabbed a backpack from the passenger seat, shut the door, and walked toward the entrance. In the darkness, I couldn't see his face clearly yet. But the way he walked, shoulders slightly hunched, long strides, a steady rhythm, made my stomach tighten. Tehran, back then, walked like that too. He stepped into the pool of light by the front doors, and I stopped breathing. That face, older, yes, more wrinkles around the eyes, a heavier jaw, a heavier skin darkened by time, but it was Tehran's face, 20 years later. Exactly what my son would look like if he had lived, the same bridge of the nose, of the same shape of the eyes, and what nearly made me collapse right there behind the steering wheel, the way he lifted a hand to brush back his hair before pushing the door open and stepping inside. Tehran had done that motion thousands of times, an unconscious habit, like breathing. I burst into tears. Not the pretty kind of crying you see in movies, the kind that shatters you, uncontrolled, like something that had been trapped inside my chest for 20 years finally cracked open. My son, alive. He was 38. He was standing there in flesh and bone. And he was heading into a night shift at a steel plant. I stayed in the car for another 3 hours, forcing myself to breathe, forcing myself to think up a plan. I couldn't just run out and hug him. I couldn't scream Tehran right in front of the factory gate like a madwoman. But I also couldn't sit here forever, watching my child live and never daring to touch the truth. At 2:15 a.m., workers started coming out for their break. A group of men stood smoking. Someone poured coffee from a thermos. Laughter and conversation mingled with the cold wind. Then I saw him. He came out alone, walking toward the far corner of the lot, away from the crowd. He leaned against the fence and tilted his face up toward the sky, as if trying to listen to something only he could hear. My heart slammed like a hammer. This was it. I opened the car door and stepped out. Every step felt weighted with stone. 20 feet. 15, 10? He turned around. Yellow light fell across his face, and then our eyes met. 3 seconds. Just 3 seconds, and I felt as if my entire life was being stretched thin inside that moment. I saw confusion flicker across his face, then something else, a flash of recognition, or only a familiarity he couldn't name. He spoke first, his voice low, tired, but I could still hear it. "Can I help you?" That voice. Taryn's voice, deeper, rougher with years, but the cadence, the placement of sound, the breath before the question. I opened my mouth. No words came out. He stepped closer, concern in his eyes. "Are you okay? You look like you just saw a ghost." That phrase made me want to laugh and cry at the same time. "Sorry," I said, gathering my voice as best I could. You look like someone I used to know." He studied my face. His expression shifted. Uncertain, confused. "That's strange," he said slowly. "You look kind of familiar, too. Have we met before?" I shook my head. "I don't think so. I'm not from here." He kept looking at me as if trying to fit a missing piece into place. "What's your name?" he asked. And before I could control it, the truth slipped from my lips, soft but final. "Vanessa. Vanessa Price." His eyes widened. "Price?" he repeated, as if hearing an old bell ring somewhere in his mind. That's what?" I asked, my heart tightening. He shook his head, swallowing hard. "I don't know. The name sounds familiar, but I don't know why." Then he added, as if to reassure himself, "My name is Miles. Miles Oakes. I'm very pleased to meet you, Miles." And we stood there, less than half a meter apart. Between me and him, it wasn't just the distance between two people. It was the distance of 20 years, of a grave, of another name, of a life that had been swapped. Miles was the one who broke the silence. "This is going to sound crazy," he said, giving a small, awkward laugh. "But I feel like I know you. Like I've seen you before, maybe in a dream or something." Cold ran up my spine. "In a dream?" I asked, my voice dropping. He nodded, discomfort plain on his face. "I lost my memory after a car accident, a long time ago. Everything before that is gone. Lately, I've started having very vivid dreams about a life I don't remember living, about people I don't know, but who feel like family." "What kind of dreams?" I asked, trying to keep my voice normal. "There's a woman who shows up a lot," he said slowly. "I think she's my mother. She's always sad, always looking at me like she's searching for something. And there's a name that keeps repeating." I held my breath. "What name?" I asked. He looked straight into my eyes. "Tehran." He said it clearly, as if reading a line already carved into his heart. "In the dream, everyone calls me Tehran, not Miles. Tehran." He swallowed. "I always wake up confused because that isn't my name." He paused. "At least, I think it isn't." The world tilted around me. "Miles," I said, and I heard my own voice tremble. "I need to tell you something. It will sound insane, but please, listen to the end." He nodded. "Okay. I had a son named Tehran," I said. "He died in a car accident 20 years ago. On November 3rd, 2005, in Newark. He was 19. Miles took a step back, his face drained of color. He stammered. "That's the day I had my accident, the day I lost my memory." "I know," I said. "What are you saying?" His voice started to crack. I stepped closer slowly, as if afraid that if I spoke too fast, the truth would run away. "I think something got mixed up that night. I think there were 2 people in the accident. One died, one lived, and the hospital mixed up who was who." He shook his head hard. No. That can't be. What's your birthday? I asked. April 12th, 1986. That's Tehran's birthday, I said, my throat tightening. He started to tremble. It's just a coincidence. You have a scar on your chin, I went on, my eyes locked on it. From when you were 7, when you fell off your bike outside our house in Newark. Right? Miles lifted a hand to touch the scar, as if noticing for the first time that it truly belonged to him. How do you know that? He asked, his voice hoarse. I don't remember. I don't remember why I have this. Because my son had that scar, I said, from when he fell off his bike in front of our home. I took him to the emergency room. I held his hand when they stitched him. Miles stumbled farther back, both hands clutching his head as if trying to keep his mind from splitting open. Stop, he said. Stop. This is crazy. Are you telling me I'm your dead son? That I've lived another life for 20 years without knowing? I know it sounds impossible, I said. But think back. Your dreams. The name Tehran. The mother in your dream. No, he murmured, but his voice weakened. 3 weeks ago, I said, striking straight at the raw place. Did you start remembering? Did something change? He froze. His face shifted. How do you know about 3 weeks ago? Because 3 weeks ago you called me, I said, from a phone number that's been disconnected for 19 years. You said you were confused, you didn't know where you were, and you asked me to come pick you up and take you home. Miles pulled out his phone, his hands shaking so badly he nearly dropped it. He breathed hard. I have this. He scrolled quickly. 3 weeks ago, I woke up and found it in my notes app. I don't remember writing it, but the handwriting is mine. He turned the screen toward me. On it were lines repeated over and over, filling the page. I am Tehran, I am Tehran, I am Tehran, dozens of times, like a cry for help, like a part of himself slamming against the wall of memory, trying to break out. Tears spilled down my face. That's because you are Tehran, I said, my voice breaking. A part of you knows the truth. You've been trying to remember. Miles looked at me, then at the phone, then back at me, his eyes full of panic and pain. If it's true, he said slowly, each word dragged up from deep inside. If I really am your son, why don't I remember? Why have I been someone else for 20 years? I don't know, I answered honestly. But we can find out. We can do a DNA test. We can know for sure. He stood still for a long time, wrestling with what he couldn't believe. Then he said, his voice rough, if we do the test, and it's positive, if I really am your son, he swallowed. That means I lost 20 years. 20 years that should have been yours, should have been my real family's. I've lived as a stranger. I know, I said, and my heart felt like it was being torn apart. And it means, he continued, his eyes reddening, that someone is lying in a grave under my name. He went on, voice trembling. Someone who might have had a family, and they never knew what happened to them. I know that too, I whispered. Miles wiped his face, as if trying to wipe away the truth itself. How do I live with that? He asked. We'll find a way together, I said, making my voice as steady as I could. If you are Tehran, my son, we'll get through it, one day at a time. He stood there a little longer. Then he nodded slowly. Okay, he said. Do the test. I need to know the truth. And in that moment, I realized my biggest fear was no longer whether Tehran was alive or not. It was a truth even more cruel. If Tehran was alive, then I had mourned him for 20 years while he was still breathing somewhere else. And if Tehran was alive, then there was a family out there who had lost their loved one. Without ever knowing why, there are answers that once opened can never be closed again. But I still had to open them. I pulled out the DNA kit Dr. Chen had sent over. Just a cheek swab, I said. 10 seconds. Miles looked at me, his eyes still unsteady. but he opened his mouth. I took the sample carefully, my hand shaking so badly I had to take a deep breath just to keep the swab from slipping and touching the wrong place. When it was done, he asked, his voice quieter, "How long until the results?" 48 hours. 2 days, he repeated, as if he couldn't believe a truth could be decided in 2 days. Yes. He looked at me for a long time. His gaze was painful, honest enough to steal my breath. "If it's positive," he said, "if I really am Tehran, I don't remember being Tehran. I've lived as Miles Oakes for 20 years. That's the only life I know." He paused. "I don't know if I can become Tehran again." That sentence cut into my heart like a blade. But he was right. "I understand," I said as gently as I could. "I just need to know the truth. Whatever happens after that, we'll handle it, one step at a time." He nodded. Then he did something I didn't expect. He lifted his hand and touched my shoulder lightly, just 1 second, but enough to make me feel as if I had been touched by a piece of Tehran I thought I had lost forever. "I'm sorry," he said, "for what you've been through, for your loss. Whether I'm Tehran or not, I'm sorry." Then he turned away and walked back toward the factory. I stood there, alone in the parking lot, until the sky began to lighten. Those 2 days were the longest 2 days of my life, longer than the 2 days after the funeral, longer than the days I waited for the divorce paperwork to be finalized, because these 2 days didn't just decide a truth, they decided whether I had lived the wrong life. They decided whether the person under the grave at Fairmount was my son, or only a name. I stayed in Scranton. I rented a cheap motel room where the smell of old carpet and bleach mixed together. I couldn't sleep. I just lay there staring at the ceiling, listening to the air conditioner click on and off, waiting for my phone to buzz the way you wait for a verdict. Miles called once, only once. His voice shook, as if it were being crushed in his throat. I can't sleep. I keep thinking, if the result is positive, then my entire life is a lie. "It's not a lie," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, even though my insides were tangled like thread. "It's just different from the truth." "What's the difference?" he asked, his voice dry and raw. I didn't know how to answer. Because sometimes different hurts no less than wrong. On the third day, at 2:30 p.m., my phone rang. The name on the screen, Dr. Chen. I stared at it the way you stare at a door, one that opens to heaven or to hell. I let it ring through 1 cycle. 2. 3. Not because I was busy, because I was afraid. Finally, I picked up. "Mrs. Price," Dr. Sarah Chen's voice came through. Tense, serious. "I need you to sit down." I sat on the edge of the motel bed. Both hands clenched the sheet as if gripping the only thing left that was solid. "Tell me," I whispered. "It's a match," Dr. Chen said. "Miles Oakes is your son biologically. The DNA match is at 99.9%. Her voice dropped for a beat, and then she said the words that made all the air in my room disappear. "Vanessa, Tehran is alive." For a moment, my world went silent. All I could hear was that sentence echoing in my head like church bells. "Your son is alive." I don't remember what I said next to Dr. Chen. Maybe I thanked her. Maybe I just hung up. I only remember that afterward. I sat there in silence, like someone who had just walked through an explosion and somehow remained whole. My son was alive. The test proved it. Miles Oakes was Taryn Price. And that dragged another truth behind it, just as cruel. The person buried under Tehran's name for 20 years was a stranger. For 20 years, I brought flowers to someone who wasn't my son. For 20 years, Tehran lived somewhere, 2 states away, carrying another name, another life, without knowing who he was. I wiped my face, took a deep breath. Then I called Miles. He answered on the first ring. "The results are back, right?" His voice was terrifyingly flat, as if he had prepared himself for every kind of pain. "They're back," I said, and I could hear my own heartbeat thudding in my ears. "Positive. You are my son. You are Tehran." Silence. A silence so thick I thought the call had dropped. Then the crying broke loose, not restrained, but real sobbing, tearing out of a man who had tried to stand upright for too long. "I don't know what to do," he said between broken breaths. "I don't know how to become him. I don't remember him." "I know," I whispered. "I've lived as someone else for 20 years, he said, as if sentencing himself. "That's who I am, Miles, not Tehran." "I know that's real too," I said. "I'm not denying it." His voice thinned. "So what now?" "What do I do? What do we do?" I blinked hard to hold my tears back. "We meet," I said. "We talk. We figure out how to get through one day at a time. It doesn't have to be perfect. We just try." We agreed to meet at a small roadside diner 2 hours later. I got there first and chose a table by the window. I kept staring out at the parking lot like I was afraid he'd vanish just because I blinked. When Miles walked in, I shot to my feet without thinking. Instinct moved before reason. We looked at each other across the diner, through the clink of forks, the hiss of the coffee machine, and people's voices. Then he walked over slowly, pulled out the chair, and sat down across from me. In the daylight, I could see him more clearly. My son, 20 years later. Wrinkles at the corners of his eyes, a streak of gray at his temple, hands rough from labor, but in his gaze, in the way his mouth curved slightly when he was anxious, I still saw Tehran. "I don't know where to start," he said softly, like he was afraid that speaking too loud would make everything collapse. "Me neither," I said. We sat in silence, mother and son, yet strangers, like two people meeting for the first time. Finally, Miles spoke first. "Tell me about him," he said. "About Tehran." "I want to know who I am." So I told him. We sat in that diner for 4 hours, and I unfolded Tehran's whole life like an old blanket, worn thin but still warm. I told him about the night he was born, about the bike fall when he was 7, about his love of drawing, about his friends, about his dream of going to college for art, about the way he always worried about me more than himself, about the night of the accident, about the 20 years I visited the grave every Sunday. Miles listened. Sometimes he nodded, like he was trying to hold on to a scrap of memory. Sometimes his eyes flashed, one spark of recognition, then gone. Most of the time he just listened with a face so full of pain that I had to clench my own hands to keep from reaching for him too soon. "It sounds like I'm hearing about a stranger," he said hoarsely. "But sometimes something feels familiar, like a memory very far away, that I can see but can't touch." "Maybe it's still there," I said, "just buried deep." "Or maybe it's gone," he said. "Maybe Tehran died that night, and the one who woke up was someone else." That sentence stabbed my chest, but I didn't argue. Because deep down, I knew the truth can be real and still be cruel. As the sun began to set outside the diner window, Miles stared out for a long time, then turned back to me. "What do we do now?" he asked. "I have a job here, an apartment, a life, and now I know everything. Is wrong? Not wrong," I said immediately. "Different, but not wrong. You lived 20 years as Miles." "That's real. That matters." "But I am Tehran," he said, as if he still couldn't believe it himself. "You can be both," I said. "Maybe you carry 2 names, 2 lives." He fell quiet, thinking for a long time. "I don't know how," he admitted. "We'll learn together," I said. "Meet often, talk. I'll tell you more about the past. You decide how much you want to keep." He looked down at his hands. "And my father?" he asked quietly. "He remarried," I said. "He has another child. I can tell him if you want." "Or not, if you're not ready." Miles shook his head. "Not yet. Too much." He swallowed. Just you. For now." Hearing him call me you and not Mom hurt, A very strange pain. Pain because I had him back, but couldn't hold the whole of him yet. I nodded. I understand. I took a deep breath, then said the other thing, the thing we couldn't run from. There's one more person, I said. The one who's been lying in the grave under your name. We need to know who he is. Dr. Chen had checked the records. The second person in the crash that night was Christopher Hayes, 19 years old, a young man who had run away with almost no family. No one searched for him. No one demanded his name back. Christopher died in the accident that should have been Tehran's, and was buried under Tehran's name. We need to give him the right grave, I said, with his real name. He deserves that. Miles nodded, eyes red. Yes, he said. He deserves that. 3 months passed. We met every week, sometimes at the diner, sometimes at Miles's apartment. Once he came back to Newark with me and stood in front of Taryn's old room. He stood in the doorway for a long time. Feels like a museum, he said softly, like I'm looking at artifacts from someone else. But then he saw the drawing, the one Taryn had made of me sitting by the window. He stopped, stepped closer, touched the frame. This, he said, his voice slowing. I remember drawing this. I stopped breathing. Not clearly, he continued, just the feeling of wanting to draw you, because you were beautiful even when you were sad. My tears fell. Not many, but enough to make me believe that Tehran was still in there. A little, but real. We exhumed the grave at Fairmount. The DNA test confirmed. The person buried there was Christopher Hayes. We held a new funeral for him. Small. Just me, Miles, and a few people from an organization that supports runaway youth. No big family, no long line of mourners, just late respect. The new headstone was engraved, Christopher Allen Hayes, 1986 to 2005. At last, he was called by his real name. Miles stood by the grave for a long time after everyone left. He died instead of me, he said. 19 years old. Never got a chance. It's not your fault, I said, making my voice firm. I know, he replied, but it still feels like I owe him, like I owe the life he didn't get to live. Then live well, I said. Live enough for both of you. After everything was confirmed, the strange calls stopped too. Tehran's number didn't ring again. Whatever it was that called me, fate, a miracle, or some glitch in the universe, it had done its work. It brought my son back. Not the way I ever imagined. Not the 19-year-old boy I lost. But a 38-year-old man who had lived another life. A man named Miles, learning how to become Tehran. Last month, for the first time, he called me Mom instead of Mrs. Price. We were having dinner. I cooked the dish Tehran used to like, though Miles didn't remember ever eating it. This is good, Mom, he said. Then he froze, as if he had just heard himself say a strange word. We looked at each other. I smiled through my tears. It feels right, he whispered. For the first time, something feels right. We will never get the lost 20 years back. He will never fully remember his childhood. I will never get to watch him grow up day by day, but we have now. We have tomorrow. We have a second chance, a chance that shouldn't have existed. I buried my son 20 years ago, visited his grave every Sunday, thought he was gone forever. Then he called me from the other side and said he was just lost. And I brought him home. If you want to hear more true stories that make you wonder, how else could life possibly turn? Then subscribe to the channel and leave a comment. Where are you watching from? So I know I'm not telling this story alone.